The salty breeze swept across the shoreline as the waves crashed against the jagged rocks. The small fishing town had seen its fair share of mysteries, but nothing quite like this. Every morning, without fail, a lone dog sat at the edge of the beach, staring out at the ocean. No one knew where he had come from. He had no collar, no visible signs of an owner. He wasn't thin enough to be a stray, but he wasn't friendly enough to belong to anyone. Fishermen who came down to the docks before sunrise often spotted him in the same spot, motionless, his eyes locked onto the horizon as if he were waiting for something, or someone. At first, people ignored him, assuming he belonged to one of the nearby houses. But as the weeks passed, the town began to notice. He was always there, always watching. He never played with other dogs, never begged for food. He never even seemed interested in the people around him. Just the sea. One morning, as the fishermen prepared to set out, old Marco, a seasoned fisherman with more years at sea than anyone could count, stopped to watch the dog. His weathered hands adjusted his cap as he narrowed his eyes. "That dog's looking for something," he muttered to himself. His younger apprentice, Luis, glanced up from securing the ropes on the boat. "Maybe he's waiting for his owner?" Marco shook his head. "Maybe. Or maybe he lost something out there." Luis chuckled. "Like what?" "A fish." But Marco wasn't laughing. Something about the dog unsettled him. He had seen animals act strangely before. A cat refusing to enter a house before an earthquake, birds fleeing just before a storm. Animals knew things. And this dog, he knew something. The fishermen continued their work, but Marco couldn't shake the feeling in his gut. After a moment's hesitation, he approached the dog cautiously. "Hey, boy," he called out. The dog didn't flinch, didn't turn, didn't even acknowledge him. Marco took another step forward. That was when he saw it. Small, barely visible under the morning sun. The dog's fur was damp, but not from the tide. There were tiny scratches on his legs, as if he had been trying to climb something. And then Marco noticed the strangest thing of all. There was something clenched between the dog's teeth. A piece of torn fabric. And it looked like it came from a life jacket. Marco's breath hitched as he crouched down, his weathered fingers reaching toward the damp, torn fabric clutched between the dog's teeth. It was bright orange. Undeniably a piece of a life jacket. His heart pounded against his ribs. The dog finally turned his head slightly, just enough for Marco to see his eyes up close. There was something in them, something beyond sadness. It was grief, desperation, a silent plea. Luis, who had been watching curiously, took a step closer. "What is that?" he asked, nodding toward the fabric. Marco held it up, turning it over in his hands. The edges were frayed, torn as if by teeth or rocks. The material was soaked with seawater, but when Marco brought it closer, he noticed something chilling. Faint, smeared letters written in black marker. A name. S.A.M. Marco's stomach twisted. His gaze flicked back to the dog, whose eyes had returned to the water, unwavering. Luis frowned. "Sam?" he muttered. "You think that's his name?" Marco wasn't sure, but deep inside, he had a terrible feeling it wasn't the dog's name. It belonged to someone else, someone who was missing. He exhaled slowly, standing up. "Something's wrong," he muttered. "This dog, he's trying to tell us something." Luis still looked skeptical. "Maybe it's just trash that washed up." But before he could finish, the dog suddenly sprang to his feet. For the first time, he moved. Not toward Marco or Luis, but toward the water. He took a few steps forward, his paws sinking into the wet sand as another wave crashed in. His body was tense, alert. And then he barked. Not a normal bark, not playful or aggressive. A warning. Marco felt a chill run down his spine. He turned his head toward the sea, squinting against the morning light. The waves rolled in, steady and endless. Nothing seemed unusual, just water stretching out into the horizon. But the dog barked again, louder this time. His front paws dug into the sand, his muscles rigid. Then, without hesitation, he bolted forward. Before Marco or Luis could react, the dog plunged into the waves, swimming furiously towards something neither of them could see. And that's when Marco noticed it. Something floating in the distance. Something that didn't belong in the water. Marco's breath caught in his throat as he followed the dog's gaze. At first, it was just a dark shape bobbing with the waves, barely visible against the endless blue. But as the sunlight shifted, a flash of orange flickered across the water. His stomach twisted. Another piece of a life jacket. The dog paddled furiously, his body slicing through the waves with determination. He wasn't just swimming. He was racing toward whatever was out there. Luis saw it too. "Dios mío," he whispered. "There's something out there." Marco didn't hesitate. "Get the boat ready," he ordered, already moving toward the dock. Luis sprinted ahead, untying the ropes with frantic hands while Marco jumped aboard. The engine roared to life, sending a spray of salt water into the air. As they pushed off, the dog was already far ahead, his head bobbing above the waves as he swam with unrelenting purpose. Come on, Marco muttered, pushing the throttle forward. The boat surged through the water, cutting a path toward the floating object. The closer they got, the clearer it became. More than just scraps of a life jacket. A piece of wreckage. Luis gripped the side of the boat, his knuckles white. "You think a boat went down?" Marco didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the scene unfolding before them. The dog reached the wreckage first. He circled it, barking wildly, his front paws slapping against the wood as if trying to climb onto it. Marco steered the boat alongside the debris, his heart pounding. Luis reached out, grabbing hold of the floating wreckage, pulling it closer. It was part of a wooden hull, shattered at the edges, the paint scraped off by the relentless ocean. But then Luis sucked in a sharp breath. "Marco, look." Marco turned, and his blood ran cold. There, clinging to the other side of the wreckage, was a hand. Pale, motionless. Marco's instincts took over. He grabbed a long pole, hooking it onto the edge of the wreckage and pulling it toward the boat. Luis reached down, fingers grasping desperately, and then a body surfaced. A man, unconscious, barely clinging to the broken wood. His face was pale, lips blue from the cold, but his chest still moved, weak but breathing. And on the shoulder of his tattered shirt, Marco saw it. A name tag, barely readable through the soaked fabric. Sam. Luis gasped. "It's him," he choked out. "Sam." Marco didn't waste another second. "Help me get him in." With practiced strength, the two fishermen heaved the unconscious man over the side of the boat. His body was ice cold, his limbs heavy and unresponsive. Water dripped from his clothes, pooling onto the deck as he collapsed in a heap. The dog, still panting from his frantic swim, scrambled onto the boat the moment Sam was safe. He whined and pressed his nose against the man's face, nudging him gently, licking the salt from his skin. His tail thumped weakly, but his eyes were wide with fear. Marco crouched down, pressing 2 fingers to Sam's neck. A faint pulse. He was alive, but barely. "We need to get back," Luis said urgently, already turning the boat around. Marco nodded. "Fast." As the engine roared, the boat cut through the waves at full speed, bouncing against the water with force. The wind whipped at their faces, but neither of them cared. Every second counted. Sam's breathing was shallow, his skin pale, lips slightly parted as if struggling to take in air. The dog refused to leave his side. His body pressed against Sam's as if willing him to wake up. Luis glanced back at the wreckage they were leaving behind. How the hell did he survive out there? Marco's grip tightened on the wheel. "I don't know," he muttered. But if that dog hadn't been watching, we never would have found him. Luis exhaled slowly, shaking his head in disbelief. You think there were others? Marco didn't answer. He didn't want to. The ocean was vast and unforgiving. If Sam had been the only survivor, it was a miracle he had lasted this long. As they neared the docks, shouts rang out. People had already gathered, drawn by the sight of the speeding boat. Marco spotted the town doctor pushing through the crowd, his medical bag clutched tightly in his hands. The boat hadn't even fully stopped when Luis and Marco lifted Sam again, carrying him onto the dock. The dog jumped after them, never leaving Sam's side. The doctor quickly checked his vitals, his face tense with concentration. He's weak, he said, but he's alive. Relief washed over them. And then, for the first time since they pulled him from the wreckage, Sam's eyelids fluttered open. Sam's eyes barely opened, his gaze unfocused and glassy. His lips parted as if he wanted to speak, but only a weak, raspy breath came out. The doctor leaned in closer, pressing 2 fingers to Sam's wrist while the fishermen and townspeople hovered anxiously. The dog let out a soft whimper, his tail wagging once before falling still. He nudged Sam's arm with his nose, as if encouraging him to wake up. Marco crouched beside them, his voice gentle but firm. Sam, can you hear me? Sam's brows furrowed slightly. A faint sign of recognition, but he was too weak to respond. The doctor looked up. We need to get him inside. He's suffering from severe dehydration and exhaustion. If he was out there all night, it's a miracle he's still breathing. Luis swallowed hard. We should get him to the clinic. With the help of a few strong hands, Sam was carefully lifted and carried toward the small medical center at the edge of the docks. The dog followed closely, his paws clicking against the wooden planks. Every time someone moved too quickly or got too close to Sam, the dog let out a low, warning growl. The moment they entered the clinic, Sam was laid on a cot, a blanket draped over his shivering body. The doctor hooked up an IV, administering fluids, while the townspeople lingered outside, whispering in hushed voices. Marco sat by the bed, watching the man they had just pulled from the sea. He was young, maybe in his early 30s, with sunburnt skin and dark stubble shadowing his face. His clothes were tattered, torn from the salt and waves. The dog sat at Sam's feet, eyes never leaving him. After a few tense minutes, Sam let out a weak cough, his throat dry and hoarse. Then, in a voice so faint they almost missed it, he whispered, Where is he?" Marco's breath caught. He leaned in. "Who?" Sam's cracked lips trembled. His eyes flickered open just a little more, searching, frantic. "Him," Sam rasped. "He's still out there." Marco's stomach dropped. Someone else had been with him, and they were still lost at sea. A heavy silence filled the small clinic. Marco felt his stomach twist as Sam's words sank in. Someone else was out there. Luis, standing near the doorway, tensed. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low, as if afraid of the answer. Sam let out a shaky breath, his eyes barely open. "Yes," he whispered. "My brother, Jake." His voice broke on the name, raw with exhaustion and something even deeper, fear. The dog, hearing the name, let out a whine and pressed closer to Sam's side. Marco and Luis exchanged glances. If Jake was still in the water, his chances were slim. The ocean was unforgiving, and who knew how long he had been out there? Marco turned on his heel. "We need to go back." Luis hesitated, but only for a second. "I'll get the boat." Sam tried to sit up, panic flickering in his eyes, but his body was too weak. The doctor gently pushed him back down. "You need rest," he insisted. "No," Sam croaked. "You have to find him." His breathing was ragged, uneven. "We were on a small fishing boat. Storm hit. We got separated." He swallowed, his voice barely a whisper. Jake wasn't wearing a life jacket. Marco clenched his fists. No life jacket. That meant if Jake was still alive, he was treading water, if he hadn't already succumbed to the cold. Without another word, Marco and Luis rushed out the door. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in streaks of red and gold, but there was no time to waste. They ran to the boat, untying the ropes in record time. As they climbed aboard, Marco noticed something. The dog had followed them. He stood at the edge of the dock, staring at them with pleading eyes. He let out a short bark, as if saying, "Take me with you." Marco didn't hesitate. "Get him in," he said. Luis scooped the dog up and set him in the boat. The moment his paws hit the floor, he ran to the edge, his eyes locked on the horizon. He knew where to go. Marco gritted his teeth and pushed the throttle forward. The boat lurched into motion, cutting through the darkening waves. Somewhere out there, Jake was still waiting, and they were going to find him. The boat cut through the waves, racing against time. The sky had darkened, and the sea was turning restless, a reminder of how merciless it could be. Marco tightened his grip on the wheel, his eyes scanning the water ahead. The dog stood at the bow, ears perked, eyes sharp. He was focused, searching. Luis held onto the side of the boat, his face tense. If he's been out here all day... He trailed off, unwilling to say the words. They both knew the odds. Marco shook his head. "We don't think like that, not yet." The dog suddenly barked. A sharp, urgent sound. His tail stiffened, his body tense. Marco followed his gaze, his heart pounding. The waves rolled, uneven and restless, but then, there, a dark shape bobbing with the tide. Luis grabbed the spotlight, flicking it on. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, illuminating the water. And then they saw him. A man, barely afloat, his arms limp, his head dipping below the surface before weakly rising again. "Jake!" Luis shouted. The dog let out a desperate howl. Marco acted fast. He killed the engine and grabbed a life ring, throwing it as close to Jake as possible. It splashed beside him, but there was no response. His body wasn't moving. "He's out!" Luis shouted. Marco didn't hesitate. He dove in. The cold water hit him like a shock, but he pushed forward, swimming hard. His arms cut through the waves, reaching the lifeless man just as another swell threatened to pull him under. Grabbing Jake by the arm, Marco turned him onto his back, keeping his head above water. His skin was ice cold. "Hold on, kid," Marco muttered, kicking against the pull of the sea. By the time he reached the boat, Luis was already reaching down, helping hoist Jake on board. Marco pulled himself up right after, dripping and breathless. Luis pressed 2 fingers to Jake's neck. "He's got a pulse, but it's weak." The dog crawled up to Jake, nudging his face, whining. His tail thumped once, as if trying to wake him. Marco took the wheel again, turning the boat around. "We need to get back now." As they sped toward the shore, the dog curled up beside Jake, never leaving his side. He had waited all day, watching the ocean, knowing his human was still out there. And now, against all odds, he had found him. The boat raced toward the shore, slicing through the dark waves. Marco pushed the throttle to its limit, his pulse hammering in his ears. Jake was alive, but barely. Every second counted. Luis knelt beside him, checking his breathing. "Come on, kid," he muttered. "Stay with us." The dog pressed himself against Jake's side, his whimpers low and urgent. He licked at Jake's face, nudging his chin with his nose, refusing to let him slip away. He had waited too long, fought too hard to lose him now. As the lights of the docks came into view, people were already gathering, drawn by the sound of the speeding boat. The doctor was there, waiting, just like before. The moment they pulled in, strong hands lifted Jake from the boat and carried him toward the clinic. The dog jumped onto the dock, never leaving his side. Inside, the doctor worked quickly, wrapping Jake in warm blankets, hooking him up to fluids. The room was tense, silent except for the occasional murmurs of concern. Marco and Luis stood near the door, watching, waiting. And then, after what felt like an eternity, Jake let out a weak cough. His chest rose in a deeper breath, his eyelids fluttering open. The dog let out a loud, joyful bark. Jake's gaze slowly turned to him. His cracked lips curled into the faintest smile. "Buddy." His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but it was enough. The dog climbed onto the cot, pressing his face into Jake's chest, his tail wagging wildly now. Tears welled in Jake's eyes as he weakly lifted a trembling hand to rest on the dog's head. Marco exhaled deeply, the tension finally breaking. He turned to Luis, shaking his head in disbelief. "That dog never gave up on him," he murmured. Luis let out a breathless chuckle. "No," he agreed, "he never did." By morning, the storm had passed, the sea calm once more. The town buzzed with the unbelievable story of a loyal dog who had refused to leave the shore, who had waited, watching, knowing his best friend was still out there. Jake would recover, but it was clear he never would have made it without his dog, without Buddy. And as the sun rose over the water, Buddy finally curled up beside Jake and closed his eyes. For the first time in days, he could rest. Some bonds can never be broken, even by the vast, unforgiving sea. Buddy never gave up, never stopped watching, and in the end, his loyalty saved the one he loved most. This story is a powerful reminder that love, loyalty, and instinct can defy all odds. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who believes in the incredible bond between humans and their animals. Because sometimes a dog isn't just a pet. Sometimes they're a lifesaver.